Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why tennis players seem to have this whole routine thing down before they serve? Is it just a bunch of superstitions, or is something deeper going on? Well, this new study dives deep into that very question, looking at how tennis players use these pre-serve routines, the little rituals they go through between points. They're trying to figure out if these routines are always the same, or if they actually change based on what is happening in the match. It is all about how athletes manage themselves, or self-regulation as the science folks call it, to do their best. So, the big idea here is that these pre-performance routines, let's call them PPR for short, aren't just something athletes do by the book every single time. Instead, the researchers propose that these routines are actually flexible. They pop up and adapt based on all sorts of things going on around the athlete and in the task itself. It's all about helping the player achieve their goal, which in this case is to make a good serve. Think about it like this. Professional tennis is a super fast game with lots of distractions. Players need to stay focused, stay ready. One way they try to create that stability is by using these pre-performance routines. What exactly is a PPR? It is basically a set of thoughts and actions a player does before performing a specific skill. Like that little ritual a basketball player does before a free throw. Or in tennis, the whole sequence before a serve. These routines are supposed to help focus the mind, get the body ready, and boost confidence. Traditionally, sports psychology has sometimes looked at these routines as something that should be super consistent. Like a strict script, the idea was that repeating the exact same steps would lead to the ideal pattern of execution. But then, other studies started showing that expert athletes actually change their routines depending on the game situation. For example, in rugby, players might change their routine if they're winning or losing, or if the shot they're about to take is a tough one. And in tennis, some studies found no connection between how consistent a player's pre-serve routine was and how accurate their serve was. That is where this study comes in, looking at whether these routines are rigid or if they adapt. To figure this out, the researchers went to an actual professional tennis tournament, the Estoril Open. They watched 10 professional players, from top-ranked guys down to players ranked in the hundreds. They filmed their entire matches and meticulously observed every single pre-serve routine, or PSR. They didn't just look at how long the routines were, but also what kind of actions players did, like bouncing the ball, adjusting their strings, or even walking around. And importantly, they noted down what was happening in the match just before the serve. How long was the last point? Who won it? Was it a really crucial point? And what was the overall score of the set? They had one main observer who was a tennis coach with tons of experience. This person watched all the videos and carefully coded every little behavior that made up the pre-serve routine. They were looking for things that could be seen, so things like thoughts or imagination weren't included. But all the observable actions were. They even had to exclude certain situations, like the very first serve of a game, or when something unusual happened, like the umpire stepping onto the court. They were really focused on getting a clear picture of the routines in normal game flow. PSR components, variability, coefficient of variation, percent of PSR time, PSR behavioral classes, and frequency of PSR behaviors per player. And what did they find? Well, the biggest takeaway is that these routines are definitely not always the same. All the players showed a lot of variation in their pre-serve routines. Some players varied their routine time by over 30%. Others changed the types of actions they did by more than 36%. And the number of actions they performed varied by up to 41%. This flies in the face of the idea that routines should be super rigid. Mean standard deviation and coefficient of variation, percent for the routines that prepared points won and lost now. Does this variability mean they're playing worse? Not necessarily. The study looked at whether the variation in routines helped players when they won points versus when they lost them. And it also looked at serves that went in versus serves that were faults. At a group level, they saw higher variability in routines that preceded points won compared to points lost, and for routines preparing serves that went in compared to faults. At the individual level, the patterns were even more interesting, with many players showing more variation in their routines when they were preparing for a winning situation. Mean standard deviation and coefficient of variation, percent per player, for the routines that prepared points won and lost. This suggests that the variation isn't necessarily a sign of being flustered, but could actually be a sign of adapting. It's like the players are fine-tuning their approach based on how the match is going. This challenges the old idea that consistency is always king. Instead, it points towards a more dynamic view of performance where adapting to the moment is key. The relation between previous point duration and PSR time, individual adaptations. But what exactly makes these routines change? The researchers looked at several contextual factors. The length of the previous point, for instance, had a big impact. They found that the number of shots in the previous point explained a significant chunk between 23% and 47%. of the variation in how long a player's pre-serve routine lasted. So, if a point was really long and exhausting, players would often take a bit longer for their routine to recover. Differences in players' PSR components after winning or losing a point. Group analysis, then there was the result of the last point. When players lost the previous point, they tended to use more self-regulatory behaviors and took more time in their routine. This makes sense after a loss. They might need a bit more time to shake it off, strategize, or refocus. Differences in players' PSR components when serving at critical points or other points, group analysis, and what about critical points, those really high-stakes moments in a match. Unsurprisingly, players tended to spend more time in their routines and perform more actions when preparing for these crucial points. It seems like players recognize the importance of these moments and adjust their preparation accordingly. Differences in players' PSR components across sets. Group analysis, even the set scores seem to matter. Players generally adjusted their routines across different sets, often spending more time and using more behaviors in the first set compared to later ones. Perhaps this is about getting settled into the match and adapting to the opponent and conditions. So, what does all this mean? The study really supports the idea that pre-serve routines are not rigid scripts. They are adaptive processes that change based on what's happening in the match. Instead of aiming for perfect consistency, athletes seem to benefit from being able to adapt their routines functionally. This variability isn't a sign of weakness or error. It is a crucial part of skillful performance in a dynamic environment. Think of it like a tightrope walker who constantly adjusts their balance. They don't have one fixed way to walk. They adapt moment by moment. The same seems to be true for these tennis routines. The findings show that players are sensitive to changes in their environment and use their routines to adjust. It is not just about executing a pre-programmed sequence, it is about interacting with the current situation. And the variations are unique to each player, reflecting their individual style and how they approach the game. The study also suggests that this variability can be linked to performance. While more variation doesn't automatically mean better performance, it seems that the ability to adapt your routine in a way that helps you achieve your goal is what matters. It's about functional adaptability, not just random changes. The fact that previous point duration, outcome, point importance, and set score all influence the routines really hammers home the point that these aren't isolated behaviors. They are deeply connected to the flow of the game. Players are constantly making micro adjustments to their preparation. So, what is the takeaway for coaches and athletes? Instead of pushing for a single rigid pre-serve routine, coaches might want to help players develop the skill of adapting their routines. It's about teaching them to be flexible, to read the game, and to adjust their preparation accordingly. Think of it as training for adaptability, not just for repetition. Now, it is important to remember this study has some limitations. The data was collected from a tournament back in 2008, so some rules have changed, like the introduction of a serve clock. Also, they could only observe visible behaviors, so things like internal thoughts or mental imagery weren't included. And it was a relatively small group of professional players. So, while the findings are really insightful, they're not the final word on the subject. But overall, this research gives us a fascinating look into the adaptive role of pre-serve routines in tennis. It suggests that these routines are dynamic, responsive, and a key part of how athletes self-regulate to perform at their best. The story here is that consistency is great, but adaptability might be even more important when it comes to succeeding in the unpredictable world of sports. What do you think about this idea of adaptable routines? Does it make sense in other sports or even in your own daily life when you have to prepare for something important? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into sports psychology. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science breakdowns, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.